All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to MediaBeacon's webinar on visual workflows. Today we have Justin Williams with us, who will be walking us through some of the new additions we have to the visual workflow editor. We'll be covering some use cases, including being able to sort content as it comes into MediaBeacon, working with some of our new nodes, including renaming files, and going through and mapping metadata between files. And also covering some ways that we interact with some of our more advanced workflows. So we'll kick it over to Justin and have him walk through what we have planned to show today. At any point, if you do have questions, please feel free and put those in the chat. We'll either field them in line with responses, or we'll save about 10 minutes at the end to cover some of your questions too. Take it away, Justin.
Good morning, everybody. This is Justin. So I'm very pleased to be able to show you some new and very interesting things we've done with the visual workflow system. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump right in to the workflow system here. And of course, as always, you have to be a global administrator to use the workflow system. And let's just go ahead and I'm going to make a brand new visual workflow here, just to give us a clean canvas to see some of these newer nodes that we've got. So we have advanced workflow, which allows us to call an advanced workflow, a JavaScript workflow, from a visual workflow. We also have a mapped metadata write, and this uses a dictionary to look for a value and then substitute another value that is in the synonyms column, and we'll take a look at that. We also can rename assets based upon metadata, which is very handy. The REST call, both the advanced workflow and the REST call are not new, but I have some examples to show everybody. And this allows us to communicate with an external REST service. And in this case, I'm going to be going and getting some information from a REST service and bringing it into MediaBeacon. We also have a new node that is in line with our new notification system. And this allows us to push a notification to our notification bell. And you don't have to have an asset subscription in order to do it. It can be an arbitrary message, which is very useful. And yeah, there's also the logger, which I'm not going to spend too much time on today. It's fairly new to MediaBeacon, but it allows you to pass a message to the system's, MediaBeacon's logging system. But we'll be looking at primarily these nodes today. So one of the things that I wanted to just quickly talk about that before we start going into some of the new ways that these particular nodes operate is just I've had some questions asking about some clarifications on asset-based triggers. We can detect, for example, in a given folder, in this case index, which is everything, when metadata is edited. But I have two things. I have a trigger filter and I have an asset filter, and they look exactly the same, and they have the same criteria. And one of the things that I wanted to really explain that's the difference between these two is the trigger filter and the asset filter allow you to choose a piece of metadata as required at the time of editing or as a result of the editing. So, for example, if I was to choose the keywords field, and I wanted to contain red, for example, here, and if I wanted to contain keywords, contains blue, we get slightly different behaviors with this. If I wish my workflow to trigger, to actually occur, an asset filter, which is sort of the standard, is going to any asset that has the keyword blue present in it before editing occurs is a candidate. However, on the trigger filter, as a result of the edit, the keywords field would need to contain red. So there's a slight bit of differentiation there, but I think it's very important to know that you can require a certain field be edited in order to trigger, and it has to be a certain value that's edited. So when I add this value and only that value to that field, then I can trigger, versus if it always has that value, then it would be triggered on any other edit. So very important to remember. The other thing that some people can be confused about is that when I have one trigger here, and I turn both trigger and asset filter on, it's as though these two criteria are considered as an AND operation. So in this case, I would have to add red to a field that has blue already. So if I wanted this to be either or of these two things, I would need to add a whole other trigger object and then just have one of these be a trigger and one be an asset. So something that I've been asked to clarify in the past, just wanted to show that. So just a little bit of background on some of the additional capabilities that we have. So let's jump along and talk about a concept that does not often get talked about enough, is something called smart names. And we are fairly familiar with smart names when it comes to something like moving an asset. So anytime I see the green brackets, either in, say, something like move asset or a very standard router node, this tells me, whoops, and I have to select a field here. Whoops. So anytime that I see a green bracket, this tells me that I am able to grab a value from another field in the asset that is currently being processed by the visual workflow. So if, for example, if I wanted to put in Dublin core keywords here, I just select the correct metaform, and it'll drop in keywords. So what this will do then is this is going to move the asset, it's in this workflow, into a folder named for the value of keywords. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing this on a multi-value field like keywords is, but you can see where the value is. The thing about smart names that some people have not necessarily been able to, haven't seen yet, is the fact that there's a little bit of special entry magic with these fields. If I enter just a bracket character, it's going to give me a pull down of all the fields that I can use here. And these are going to be prefaced, or rather they're going to be labeled for the display names, not the internal names. So this is a very fast way if you know if you know the names of your fields. It's a very, very fast way to enter them, and I use this a lot. There are cases, however, where you will end up having fields that might be similar. I've seen some cases where I've named two different fields the same thing, and it's not necessarily going to show you. So I can copy this value of keywords right here, and I can actually show you what's going on behind there. It's actually a string that looks like this. And this allows us to, if you wanted to, just to drop in any field by using its URI and its namespace directly. The only real difference is that instead of 2 colons here, you have to put in $3. So that's how you can directly enter this If you want to, you can copy and paste that text. That is just as kind of basics on how the smart names operate. So likewise, if I wish to drop in a smart name here, I can either use the editor like this, or I can use the pull down, which is really useful. One thing that is fairly new to MediaBeacon are a couple of special fields that are special smart names that I find most useful with things like our send notification node. So the send notification node is very much like email. In fact, the old email one used to be called notifications, and this one just sends an email. But the notification one is going to push a notification to a specific user, and it's going to have a specific message. One of the things that might seem complicated at first is, well, how in the world do I know who to send it to if I don't have that user's name in metadata? To handle that, if you type in bracket user, you're going to see a set of fields, user.email, user.firstname, user.lastname, and user.username. These are all going to dynamically pull that data for the user who triggered this event. So if I trigger something, it's going to send me and only me feedback. So very, very handy. And you can use either user email or user username, doesn't matter which, and it's going to send the initiating user a notification. With this particular node, this one is just invaluable to me. I'm always going to want to use that one. So really, really useful. So that is just a little bit on one of the two special smart names that I want to talk about. The other one is a little bit more esoteric, and it is called input. This is kind of a special thing. Like the other four before that I talked about, they're not actually metadata fields. You can pick all of them using the smart name picker. This one is listed under node input and input, but you can just type in input and it's going to fill in. What this does is it allows the information that was passed to this particular node from the last node to be entered as metadata. Now, this is not always going to be very useful, but it becomes useful especially with the advanced workflow and the REST. Because when we call an advanced workflow, we are expecting that advanced workflow is going to have a result, or I'm sorry, a return value. It's going to return a given value. That value returned by the advanced workflow is going to be cast into this input smart name. And then I can utilize that to do other things that I might need to do. So extremely, extremely useful. And I of course, have some examples of those that we'll talk about a little bit later. Advanced workflow and REST, as I said, are probably the best candidates to make use of this. And both of these have something that I only recently learned about, or how to use it effectively, which are parameters. Really, really useful. Parameters are some pieces of information. It's a name-value pair that is passed into either the advanced workflow or to a REST URL, and I'll show you some examples of that. So target workflow, this one is a little bit interesting. We have a case here, we have a bracket and a folder icon. The folder icon, because we're only can select workflows with this, will just give me the list of workflows I have and allows me to choose one. And it does that by a file path. However, if I were to have this file path in metadata, I could call it that. I could reference it that way as well. So I could have different assets doing different workflows based upon metadata. Usually, though, I'll just be calling it by its static address. And I'll go more into how we can use parameters and how they get pushed into workflow and how they come back out, and I'll demonstrate that in just a bit. The REST calls are, I'm going to show the get method right now. I don't have a great post example, but I can call out to an URL that's got a REST service on it, and it's going to give me back some information. And for example, I have a couple of we have this type of code, just has some very basic demo, a very basic REST service that you can use. And the two I'm looking at here are, we've got albums and users, and we've got a big long list of sort of these JSON statements. One of the really nifty things that you can do with many services is, for example, I only want to see the third record, so ID 3, and that's going to just return back ID 3. And likewise, if I want to say name equals Samantha, oh, I didn't, that's username. There we go. So it'll return just that record. So this is all the REST service doing that magic. But how can I pass a dynamic value to this URL? And that's what the parameters for the REST call are for. If I choose ID, and I've got albums here, even though I'm not actually putting it directly on this line, I will be passing to albums basically the string $ID equals 3. So I can use a parameter to control that source. Likewise, this is a smart name, so I can pick this up from another piece of metadata. So again, I can be very dynamic with the kind of data that I pull. And the REST call as well, its result is going to be inside that input smart name, so then I can pass that along to something else to have it further processed. So, and we'll see both of these in action in a couple of our examples. All right. Let's see, is there anything else that I wanted to cover? Oh, there is one thing that I guess I just didn't notice for the longest time. When I am selecting a folder to use as my trigger, at some point we put in the ability to add a new folder. And I had never seen it before. And oftentimes I'd be editing my workflow away and realized I needed to set a particular folder as the watched folder, and it didn't exist yet. And I had to stop, save it, go back, create, etc. Now you can just do that in one step right here. So really handy. I can't even tell you when that showed up. I missed it personally. So, but that's most of the new stuff that you're going to see. We'll talk a little bit about the rename asset as well. In this case, the rename asset is going to make a lot of use of the smart names, because when people are renaming assets, the big ask that we've had is to rename that asset based upon metadata. So what I might do, for example, is I might have, say, a year, and I'll say project 11, and we might have, say, file source, and then we'd enter just like an extension. The one thing that's a little bit of a chore is you do have to make sure to put in the entire file name. It's not going to just pick up the extension. And I actually have a method I can show you that will ease that a little bit, so you don't have to create tons and tons of different rename assets for different file types. So we'll talk about this as we go. So that's just some of the nodes, but let's go ahead and we're going to see those in action. Let's take a look at an advanced workflow that's being called by a visual workflow. So I'll demonstrate what it does first before we take a look at it. The goal of this workflow is to check that these two values in these two fields are not the same. And if they are, send the user a notification. So if I choose the main color as black here, and highlight color, I don't know if that should be green or orange, but we'll just choose orange. And these two values match just fine. Or rather, I should say, they're not the same, so they are not going to give us a bad message. So we can see that color values are entered correctly. Now, if I do the same operation, but I'll use the same colors, let's say I put in yellow and yellow, and hit save, it's going to give me a very different message. So please correct matching color values. The way that we're accomplishing this on the back end is taking a look at the main visual workflow that I'm calling here. I'm just passing right into the advanced workflow. But what I'm passing the advanced workflow is based on a couple of parameters. I'm passing the asset ID so that the advanced workflow knows what asset to deal with, and I'm also going to pass it its file name. I think actually I didn't need it, but those are the kinds of values that you can pass into an advanced workflow. From there, we're going to use the file name, and we're going to also print whatever this workflow gives us back as a notification. So let's take a look at the referenced workflow, which is compare metadata values. And it's a crude workflow, but really what's going on is I'm just grabbing the asset ID here, and I've got this hard coded in. We're just using a very basic field. I've just got my URI here, and I've got my namespaces here. And I'm just assigning those to a couple of variables and just comparing the variables. If they're the same, then nope, please correct. And if not, then values are entered correctly. So very simple, not super complex, but this just allows us to generate two different messages by comparing strings together. And I could do all sorts of like fancy text parsing inside an advanced workflow like this. So that's a good example of what we can do with just by calling an advanced workflow. Let's take another look at advanced workflows and how we can use parameters in a little more crunchy fashion. We can actually do something with the parameters. And the example I'm going to use is we're going to look for a particular value on Dublin Core keywords, either red or blue. And based upon that, we're going to pass different parameters into our advanced workflow, and we're going to get a different output. So in this case, all I'm going to be doing is not writing red or blue. In this case, I'm just going to trigger this. And we can see that it's going to give us cats and dogs as an output. And I'm just going to stamp this with the blue value and then trigger it. And we can see that we get entirely different information there. Now, if I change this value to green, that's a third choice. And we can see that, error, no parameters have been passed. So the way that this was accomplished is, this is my call advanced workflow. And the router here is just going to show, we've got three basic paths, red, blue, or green. Otherwise, it's going to error out and it's not going to do anything. But in each case, I am passing to a particular advanced workflow. I'm passing a couple of parameters here, one called cats, one with the value of cats, one with the value of dogs. Likewise, owls and lizards, and in this case, no parameters whatsoever. And these are all being piped into the same advanced workflow. And we can see that is the return parameter values. And all I'm doing here is simply getting the parameter names. And if there are no parameters, then it's going to give an error. Otherwise, it's just going to give us the values of all the parameters, comma separated. So very crude string processing, but just to give you an example that you can use those parameters to send messages that aren't necessarily contained in metadata. They can be inside the workflow themselves. The next one that I wanted to show is the asset metadata map. And to do this, I wanted to be able to show that the example I've got here is there are times that there's going to be associated information that is contingent on some other information. So a good example is countries and country codes. So the country here has a corresponding value. There's the standard 2-letter country codes and 3-letter country codes. And what's going to happen here is when I choose just one of these values, as long as the other two fields are blank, it's going to fill the others two in based upon some metadata mapping. And the way that we accomplish this is we use our dictionaries. So to support this, I have a series of 4 dictionaries, and each of them represent a shift from one type of data to another. So in this case, I have the 2-letter country codes to English. In this case, I have English to 2 letters and 3 to English and English to 3 letters. So by using these, I can use the metadata right, and I can push those values based upon which fields are empty. So I'll show it in action, then we'll take a look at the actual metadata. Oops. So I'll blank out those fields. So there's nothing there. Also, as an additional trigger, I built this in. This workflow is not going to fire unless I have map metadata to assets selected when I fill this out. This may not be something that you'd want to put in as a trigger for users. You may want to have this be automatic. But just to show that you can have, you can decide to process something based upon sort of a standard idea of a trigger. Maybe that's what I forgot earlier. So if I drop in, say, Antarctica, and I hit save, and I didn't do anything wrong, so it's not going to give me a notification. You can see it automatically fills in these other values. And however, if I make a mistake like putting in 2 values, this should give me an error message. And we have a notification here that says, ensure that just a single country field is filled out. So one thing I did want to mention is that at the present time, we don't have the ability to click on a notification and have it open up the asset, but that is something that that is, I believe, on the horizon. So that's something that's on the way. But so this, well, let's take a look exactly how I accomplish that. So the first thing I do once an asset is coming into this workflow is I'm clearing the trigger, and that's just that checkbox. Next, I'm going to find out, is the country field empty or not? And if it's empty, I'll go here. If it's not empty, go here. And basically, all of these routers are helping me to find out what the case is between those three fields. If something is empty, whether it's filled. So in all the error cases, it just goes to one notification that will just inform the user that, no, you can only have one field filled. And then based upon which two other fields are empty, I can map from C1 to C2, et cetera. C2 being the alpha 2, so the two-letter country code. And I wanted to just briefly talk about how you configure the mapped metadata write node. It's a little bit non-obvious in a couple of ways, but it does make sense. We have two fields here that have a file browser and also a smart name. This one is special because this one specifically looks for dictionaries. You can pre-select it. But if you had that name of the dictionary as metadata, you could reference it via a smart name. Likewise, we have a couple of different fields down here that select what fields are going to be acted on. So word, this is literally, instead of choosing the value of a field, this is choosing a field specifically. So unlike other smart name fields where you're trying to get the value, I'm talking about the third field. Word is the field, the value in the field that you're trying to pick up. So that one is as normal. This third one is a little bit of an oddball. This is one where you're trying to define the field that you're going to write to. So for this one, I suggest that although you can choose a field here, you may want to just fill out the actual URI and namespace. So these are the three things you need to configure, basically. What dictionary you're going to use, what the word is, and this is the source field as well, and what the output field is going to be. So we can see that all moves right in there. So, all right. Let's take a look at the rename operation. And I'll grab an asset and drop it in rename. And what we want to do is we're sort of considering this cat to be a car. It's got a year, model, and style. And one of the things about when you're creating folders or renaming things based upon metadata, it's always a really good idea to have a dictionary because you don't want to have arbitrary values. And it's always a really good idea to make sure that these fields are completely filled out. Now, I can do this by having these fields be required. I can have this by the visual workflow triggers, just making sure that these are filled. But I'm taking a slightly different tactic here. I want to tell the user what they've forgotten. So, and this one is a bit simple. I'm just going to try to rename this asset without filling any of this out. So what should be happening here is I should be getting a notification that tells me I can't do that. I can't process this file because the year field is empty. And as you'll see the workflow, it's fairly simple. I'm only checking and erroring out at each different field, but this will tell me at least which fields I have forgotten. So once I've done that and actually entered the correct, let's see, I think this is a late model cat. And this is clearly a roadster and definitely a hybrid. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Because all those values are entered, it's going to perform that rename. And we can see now that the name of the file is 2015 Roadster Hybrid. So I changed that name just based on metadata. Just to glance at the workflow, there is one little additional thing that I did with this that I wanted to talk about. All right, so what I'm doing here is, again, first thing I'm doing is I'm clearing that trigger. So if it fails, it can be triggered again. And I'm just going to look through each of those fields and say, oh, is any of these empty? And this is a fairly simple case. I'm not doing a matrix of different, it's not going to tell me exactly all the fields. It's just going to error out in each case sequentially. And I'll just send a notification, and each one has a slightly different message that says which field it is. So a little less complex example, but again, very easy to set up. Once I know that all these are filled out, I'm going to do that metadata write. That's easy. Or rather, before I'm going to do renaming of the asset, there's a little bit of an issue. What is my file extension? Because I have to fill that in. Now, you could use a router, and you could build this big, complicated thing that is going to, route things based on the original file name. But I decided to go for something a little bit smarter. And I'm using a dictionary that has it's based on our file formats dictionary, and MediaBeacon records a file format for every asset that comes in, and based upon that metadata in a dictionary, I'm just going to write that value to a suffix field, and that's my file suffix temp right there. So this way, I can have a little bit more flexible way of doing it. Another cooler way of doing this would be to send the original file name string to an advanced workflow, parse the string, find out what just the ending string is, and then what I would do here, after coming back from the advanced workflow, is I'd put in input, because this is getting the input from that workflow. But in this case, I did it in a somewhat simple way. Let's take a look at the last thing, or one of the last things. Asset sorting. I've shown this before, and there's a very basic example of this built into MediaBeacon. It's called example, but I wanted to show a slightly more built up one. So I'm going to drop something into asset sorting. Oops. And I'm going to enter some metadata. And again, I have this set up as a trigger. I have to check this checkbox in order to affect this. But typically what people will do is they have this set on an upload folder, and as soon as an asset comes into the system, it would take a look at the metadata and then sort based upon it. Now, that of course means that you're going to have a upload metaform in front of that makes sure to gather all these things. But just to show that you don't have to do it that way, again, we're going to use a very similar situation to our rename, and this is going to give me errors if I leave anything empty. But just to give the fast example, I'll just fill out all of these. And when I hit sort assets, it'll go ahead and process those. And we should see here that now asset sorting has a new 2006 folder, a coupe folder, and a gasoline folder. So there you have your gasoline powered jack-o'-lantern from 2006. Very, very simple to accomplish. This is kind of like the major use case that I normally show, but I just wanted to make it a little bit more obvious. So again, we're going to check and see if anything's empty, send notifications, And then all I'm doing is just moving that asset into a folder structure based on those folders. And it's always going to have that structure. So this string here really defines the structure of how those folders, what their relationship is. Model is always subordinate to year. So I don't need to have any relationship recorded in the metadata itself. This is what defines it. So I could change it around if necessary. Also worth noting, and I won't go into this too much, is I usually use a non-relative folder. So this is actually, doesn't show it to you, but it's going to what would be called index, or the master index of the system. So again, very, very useful. So we've got just a few minutes left, and I wanted to quickly show the REST node and how we can do some kind of interesting things with that. So what I want to do with my REST node is I want to call out, I want to say, hey, albums, I want to see record number 3, and I want to get this string back. And I'm going to put that into a notification. And for this JSON here, I'm going to call out, I think it was a username that I put in, and I want to get back the email and cast that into a notification. So going and grabbing another piece of information, and I'm going to go put that into notification. So if we take a look at all right here, so there are a couple of things here. So if I have a record ID, there we go. This one is, I didn't fill out the other one. So with this one, I'm going to be looking for a user. And I don't care about the record ID, but I do care about, in this case, the value I'm looking for is the username. And all I have to do is, I'm using the same trigger for everything. So, and what that's done is it has called out to that was somebody else. It wasn't Samantha. It was Brett. And you can see that Brett's email is sincere@april.biz. So I was able to grab that value and bring it back. And let's take a look quickly at how I accomplish that before we break for some questions. So based upon the fact that my REST ID was empty, oops. So if it has an URL, it knows that it has to read that URL and it needs to pass that REST key value. And once that's done, it's going to actually accomplish that. And whenever, in my particular use case, I was passing username. So it's going to send username, and once that is processed, we're going to go to the advanced workflow. And here's where our input comes in. What I'm getting back from the REST call is a big, long JSON string. It's a great big thing. And I am putting that in as an input variable into my advanced workflow. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what's inside that thing. Oops, sorry. It's this parse JSON. So it's really simple. All I'm looking for is I just want to grab the username, if it's the right kind of thing, and I'm just looking for its email. So find that object, grab the email, and just return that out. So that is kind of the back and forth between those things. So I think that's kind of everything I wanted to show. Addison's giving me the signal that now it's time to take some questions on some of the things that we've seen today, or anything about visual workflows in general.
So thanks so much, Justin, for taking us on a walk through the visual workflows. I think we hit a couple really key things that really have been asked for by kind of our whole customer base to be a little more configurable and a little easier just within the system. Taking things and being able to rename files, an ask certainly I've had for a long time, that we took the really approach of just putting that into your hands, making it configurable, making it easy to go through and set up. Keeping that in sort of line with how we go through an approach, the ability to sort based off that too. Really two key areas of using data to redescribe through the name, and also sort appropriately within. One of the cooler new things too, of course, that kind of came up through all of this is our ability to use notifications. And that was actually one of the questions we had come in through the chat, so just wanted to say that one out loud here too. Basically on sort of system-wide notifications was sort of the question. Currently, we can get there just by kind of exporting the full list of, say, like users in the system, applying them back to the node. Part of the things that we have for enhancements on this too, making it very streamlined and simple to basically fulfill the use case of saying, hey, we're going to have some downtime coming up, or hey, there's a new ad or feature that everyone in the system should know about within, and making that easy just through the notification node. Generally by going through and using things like groups, maybe as a part of the smart names to go through and identify sets of users, but still looking for ways to go through and bring that in. We'll give it a couple minutes here. Just if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to chat that in just to everyone on or myself privately. So we'll hang out on the line here for a minute and see if we have any questions come in. Okay. Doesn't look like we have too much coming in quite yet. Thank you everyone so much, and thank you Justin for leading us through today. If follow-up questions do hit you after we get off the call here, please feel free to send those in to Justin or myself, or any other contacts you have here at MediaBeacon. Thanks for taking some time to look at visual workflows, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And if anybody has any other ideas for topics they'd like to see, topics in this webinar they'd like to see a greater depth or more explanation on, that's all stuff that we'd really like to hear from you. So you can email myself or any of our communications team for topics for new webinars, because we want these to be geared toward what you as our audience and customers, what you need, what you want to see, information that you want to know. So it's very informative to us, and it gives us a great way to connect with you guys. So any questions you have now or ideas for topics, that's wonderful. So thank you everybody, and we'll see you next month with another topic like this one. Thanks very much, and have a beautiful day.